Hey, Sam here from Folk of All Trades, and my partner Danny is behind the camera today. We're out in the garden, in our beautiful garden, where we really like to spend a lot of time. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking about preparing the soil today, so I know a few people may still be jumping on. So I just wanted to say, glad to have you with us. It's an absolutely glorious day. If there are any problems with audio, please let me know. I'm going to try and speak nice and loud. But we are outside, so I'm hoping everything works out in that way. So, as I said, preparing the soil is today's topic. Lots of people are becoming interested in vegetable gardening, which is fantastic. It's one of my absolute favourite hobbies. And I really want to thank the people who have helped us put this together today. So that's Resilient South Council Partnerships. So that's City of Holdfast Bay, Marion, Onkaparinga and Mitcham. And also the Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges Natural Resources Management Board. So big thanks to them. And I also want to acknowledge that we are here on Kaurna country, Kaurna Yurta, and I want to acknowledge them as the first peoples to actually grow food here. And I want to thank them for taking care of the land for thousands and thousands of years. And I'm honoured to be walking the same land and to be growing food here as well. So I'll just give you a quick overview of what we will actually be covering today. But while I'm doing that, if you could actually post in the chat function, if you could just comment whether you are currently growing a veggie garden, whether you just have a bare patch that you're keen to start, and maybe a worst case scenario, if you've got a really weedy patch or kikuyu or some kind of lawn that you're going to try and dig up and start growing vegetables on. I'm going to cover how to cope with all those situations and how to prepare the soil to give you the best chance of success. So yeah, the first thing I'm going to talk about is that situation where it's a bit weedy. There's never really been vegetables grown there before. How to deal with that. Then I'm going to move on to the second example, which is, all right, we've got our land clear and ready to go, and we're going to start preparing the soil, incorporating some compost and other nutritious stuff so our plants thrive. And then I'm going to move on to sort of the prepared bed, or a bed that's already grown food in the past, for instance, over the summer season, or maybe it's something you've inherited that hasn't grown food for a little while. Either way, I'm going to talk about all my methods for how I actually prepare the soil for planting. So this is a bed that we're going to be planting next week in the second workshop, which is all about planting and caring for your plants. So hopefully you'll join us for that one too. So let's check in on what are people saying, Danny? Can you tell? None yet? Okay, no worries. So let's go out the front and we'll start to look at a weedy patch and how we might deal with that. Follow me. So as you can see here, there's quite a few weeds, some of which have just germinated recently with the rain that we've had. Others like this, I call this wire weed. I don't know if that's the proper name. This one's actually been here all summer, and I don't actually mind it sticking around over summer because it's just got a central point that it joins to, and so it's actually really easy to get rid of, and it's actually done a great job of mulching this soil and protecting it over those summer months. So I wouldn't really weed before I'm going to actually get stuck in and start doing stuff. Otherwise, you're just creating extra work for yourself. So you might be able to see we've got some other weeds here. Soursobs, they're a real issue in our garden. They come up from little tubers, little rhizomes under the ground about this time every year, and they just keep coming and coming. But then we've also got this plant here is mallow, and mallow is actually edible. I mean, soursobs are as well, but mallow is sort of a straight spinach substitute, and it's actually really, it's quite tasty. So before you just go and throw away all your weeds, if you check out books like this one's really good, the Weed Forager's Handbook, you can actually get a feed out of your garden before you even begin, which is kind of awesome. So my first plan of attack is to actually get rid of these weeds, and I'll just be leaving them in place. So I'm going to use my stirrup hoe here, which is sharp on both sides. If you've got any kind of hoe, that's a good tool to be using. This one's great because it's sharp on both sides, so I can pull, but I can also push and actually cut things like that away. And so just pushing those to the side, I'd go along and I'd actually clear a patch. Now, if you're really, really keen, you can actually start to dig these things out by their roots. So particularly things like soursops, you know, just by cutting the tops off, I've weakened them, but I haven't killed them. They will come back. So I can find a soursop and actually dig down and try and remove that, which is where it's storing all its energy and where it will reshoot from. So I'd have a bucket here and I'd be collecting those up. You know, it's not for the faint-hearted because there are a lot of them. My preferred method is to actually just slash everything down and then to cover it up with something. And I will say, if you don't have access to a hoe, then you can use something like a spade with a nice sharp edge and actually just go along and use it in the same way, chopping. We're not going very deep, we're just skimming along the surface and just chopping things off at the base. So that's how I actually did my first garden, and it was back-breaking work. It's not the best tool for the job, but if it's all you've got, then make the most of it. So I'm going to imagine that this is really nicely cleared now. It's the area that I want. And I'm going to lay some cardboard down. Now I've removed all the labels as best I can, and the sticky tape as well, because I don't want that in the soil. And I would just place that directly on top of the soil. At this point, if that was the width of my bed, I might take some of this extra soil that's actually going to be my path, so I don't need to stand on my bed, and I would bring it over on top and actually start to build up with this precious topsoil. And at that point I might add compost and things like that, but we'll talk about that as part of our other examples. So that's a pretty easy way, I suppose, to just get on top of things and start growing as quickly as possible. So let's go to our second example, and if you've got any questions about what I've just talked about, feel free to jot them down and I'll answer them at the next location. Cool, so here's an area I've prepared earlier. I feel like a chef saying that. But yeah, we basically just have put cardboard. This was actually covered in cardboard for the whole of summer. We had just some bark chips and things stored here. So it's been resting. It's never grown veggies before, and so it's really, really compacted. We're on clay here, as lots of Adelaide is, unless you're sort of right next to the coast, and then you're probably a more sandier soil. But you know, clay's no problem. It just needs a certain approach. So I've got my soil here, and as I say, it's pretty firm because of the summer we've just had. Thankfully a little bit of moisture because of the rain in the last couple of days. And my preferred method for actually starting to aerate this soil and improve its structure is to use something like this, something like a fork with quite thin tines. If you've only got one with thicker tines, that's okay, but the thin does make it a little bit easier for what we're about to do. And basically we're putting a fair bit of our weight onto those tines and then just levering back. And you see how the soil is kind of just lifting up like that? I'll do it again, moving backwards, just lifting. And when I'm doing that, I'm actually creating these channels. I'm only getting about that deep, but I'm creating these channels into the soil and just sort of breaking up that compacted pan. This is the last time I'm going to be walking on this bed. So I'm starting in the back corner. It's just like painting. If you were painting the floor, you wouldn't want to back yourself into a corner. So just moving along, doesn't take too long. If you've got a heavy friend, then ask them to come over. Danny doesn't have very much success with this because she's so light to actually get it into the ground. And then I would continue on and on. So basically by doing that, I'm not disturbing the soil and hurting it in any way. So I actually advocate for no dig gardening, and basically what that means is after that initial preparation I don't plan to turn this soil or disturb it much at all. So the benefit of that is soil is kind of like an apartment building. That's how I think of it anyway. There's all of these microorganisms that live at different levels, and the ones that live at the top level right at the surface, they don't want to be down 5 stories. And so when you turn the soil, when you invert it, you are just creating havoc with all of those species. You're breaking up all of the mycelial, hyphae that are cruising through there, the fungus that's growing through the soil, and you're just playing absolute havoc. So I prefer this, which is a much sort of lighter disturbance, and frankly it's easier as well. this double digging method that you see sometimes in old school books, you know, that's from the UK, where, you know, they've got feet and feet of topsoil. Here in Australia, I think it makes much more sense to preserve that topsoil layer that we've got, which is quite thin. Speaking of mycelium and hyphae, when I just pulled this this path material back earlier, I noticed all this white stuff, and that is actually the it's a fungus that's feeding on this bark chip, and so that's the kind of thing that you are ripping apart when you disturb the soil. So we want to try and do that as little as we can. So probably should have started with it, but I just want to talk really quickly about why this spot is good in some ways to be growing veggies, and maybe why it's not so ideal. So I'm facing north right now. You can see the sun is hitting me almost square in the face, and that's ideal in the southern hemisphere because the sun will actually come up in the east, cruise around to the west, and so I want to be on the north side of something like this. If I was trying to grow south side of a heavy hedge like this, my plants aren't going to get enough sun and they're not going to thrive. So it's really good that I'm facing north. I'm getting morning sun, but behind Danny is actually our house, which is shading us from that harsh summer sun. So that's really the ideal situation. We deliberately put our house that way so that we could have this east-facing garden. If you don't have the choice, then try and make sure you're getting in a spot that has at least 6 hours of sun a day for things like leafy greens. If you want to be growing fruiting things like broccoli and cabbages and things like that in this season, tomatoes and capsicums and all that kind of stuff in the summer season, you need minimum 8 hours sun. So have a think about where you put your beds for that reason. The other thing you really need to think about is competition. So it's not really ideal that I've got this hedge here, because its roots, and you can actually see them, its roots are coming up into this. They were looking for moisture under the cardboard, and so they would actually compete with whatever we plant here. So what we could do is actually put a root barrier, dig down and actually put a piece of tin or something to try and stop those roots coming in, or we could try and build a raised bed or a wicking bed, something like that. So I advocate for in-ground growing. I really think the soil is the most amazing thing that you can grow plants in. It's what they've evolved to grow in. And I don't even edge my beds. In the past we've edged beds, but we really don't find it necessary for the way that we garden, and it's less work and less resources as well. But if you did want to, edge your garden, you like things to be neat and straight, fair enough. Something that I'd advocate using is these flat pack timber frames. They're getting a little bit harder to find now, but if you do find them, they're quite useful because they stack flat when you're not using them, and they're just sort of big enough to just sort of high enough to hold a bit of soil, but not go so high that they're going to dry out. And that's the biggest problem with raised beds, is that by creating all of this extra height, you're allowing drying to happen, and that's no good for your plants. You have to use extra water and they're more stressed. So if you are the kind of person that needs real raised beds, maybe you've got mobility issues or you're older, you could stack some of these up to 4 or 5 high. But what I'd recommend you do is actually put something in the bottom that will raise your soil up off the ground, so you're not wasting all of this soil underneath. Something like broccoli boxes or old crates, something like that. There's some cool stuff online, and in a similar way you could do a wicking bed where you're raising it way off the ground, but I shouldn't get into wicking beds because that's a whole topic in itself. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this spot. I've got our actual growing space over here in our main vegetable garden, so follow me, we'll go and check that out. And if there are any questions at this point, feel free to tap them in. Danny will read them out to me and I can get to them. So we've just got here, I wanted to show you another weeding method. We've got our chickens, our 3 girls, in this chicken tractor that we took an old rabbit hutch and converted it, made it a bit bigger. Now a chicken tractor is no good for permanent chicken living. This is just a special treat for them to help us clear this bed. And I only put them in here a couple of minutes before we started this video, and they've pretty much eaten all of the soursops that were germinating, and done a couple of poops as well to fertilize the soil for us, so thank you girls. We only leave them in here for maybe 20 minutes, half an hour at the most before we move them on to a new location. It's just not big enough to support chicken living all the time. They live out here in a much bigger run, but as I say, we put them in here for special treats and to do work for us. So if you hate weeding and you've got chickens, you know, make two problems a solution. So come down to the end of the bed. This is where we were growing tomatoes over the summer season, and I left a couple here just to prove it, and you can see our tomato structure there where we had strings running down and the tomatoes growing up. So we've ripped those out now. They were getting less and less productive, and we actually now want to plant brassicas, things like broccoli and cabbage and kohlrabi and things like that in this bed. But I wanted to show you my method for actually removing old plants, because it might be a bit different to what you've seen before. It's another no-dig method, where instead of actually ripping this plant out of the ground and taking a lot of soil with it and a lot of roots as well, what I actually really like to do is find where it goes down into the ground and just cut it off. Now, that might seem like kind of a strange thing to do, but the thinking is that by cutting that plant off, I've almost certainly killed it, and now all of those roots are going to start to rot away. And basically what was happening above the plant in terms of how many branches it had is replicated below. It's just that normally when we rip out a plant, you know, we see a tiny fraction of it. So I'm wanting all of those roots to die back and create channels in the soil. And those are going to allow the compost that I'm going to put in to get down into those grooves, down to where the new roots will be. Other plants' roots will follow that, and it makes it much easier for them, so they have to spend less energy putting out new roots. And then all of the microorganisms in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, the single-celled organisms, they're just going to have a field day down there eating that stuff as well. So that's the method that we use for removing things. We tend to just cut it off. Maybe every now and again things will re-sprout. We just cut it off again, and you know, very soon the broccolis and things that we're growing will be shading that out anyway, and they'll take over. So next thing to do is to get our irrigation out the way, and irrigation, such a time saver. I'm a big fan of this drip line. Might talk a little bit more about that next week when we talk about planting. Okay, so we were talking about the mulch that's currently covering the soil. So we really want to remove that. You know, it's done its job. It's covered the soil and protected it, and potentially now it's harboring disease, and we just don't need it. Lots of small things like to hide in this and eat seedlings, and so I really like to remove it, especially when I'm planting new things. So I'm just going to step behind Danny and grab my rake and clear some of that away.
Hi everyone, as some more people are coming in, our phone just shut down. We think it got too hot, so we're back now, and I think more people are joining us.
So it's kind of hard to see here, but we do have a bed, and then we've got paths either side. The bed is about 80 centimetres wide, and then our paths are roughly 30 centimetres. And I've already taken the soil from where the path was and built it up here. So this is quite raised, and then there's just bark chip basically filling that void that we can walk on, and that can sort of slowly break down and give carbon as well. So we've got a couple of weeds here. I've got a different tool. This is a Japanese hoe that we got from Heirloom Harvest, and it's really efficient at just slicing roots off. This is actually from the straw itself. This germinated, and the chickens love it, so I'll put it over there for them to eat later. Not too many weeds here. The mulch did a good job. So just clearing those few things that remain, and I'll actually compost this this spent mulch that's had a season. This is a really good carbon addition to your compost, so you know it's valuable. So we've got a bare bed, and I typically don't like to leave beds bare like this for very long. You know, the sun is its enemy. It's drying it out. It's cooking all the little microorganisms that were there. So I'm going to cover it as soon as I can. I've got here a complete organic fertilizer, COF, C-O-F, that a friend of ours makes. We might put a link in the description below later. And basically it's byproducts, so animal and plant byproducts, and it's got some slow release stuff in it. It's got some quick release stuff in it. It's all really good plant food. So I tend to just give it a bit of a sprinkle. It's got trace minerals, which are really important for plants as well, and much more likely to be able to find is something like this sea mungus. This is an organic product made by Nutrog here in South Australia, and it's basically composted manures plus then kelp and rock dust, so lots of those micronutrients that maybe you wouldn't get from compost or from local animal manures that are eating the same plants. And so there's, for instance, if it was a copper deficient area, you just wouldn't be getting any copper. So it's good to have something like this, which has all of the trace minerals, all the trace nutrients that plants need. And I just give a very small handful of that. And then finally, the good stuff, homemade compost. So, you cannot buy this. You cannot buy homemade compost. And it's full of junk. It's full of stuff that hasn't fully broken down. Basically everything that our garden produces that we don't eat, it gets thrown in there, plus all our veg food scraps, plus horse manure. So this is just the best stuff, and I'm pretty generous with the application because I also kind of use it as a mulch. Now, a lot of people prefer a really fine sieved compost because they understand that when you actually bury bits of uncomposted material like this, they do rob the soil of nitrogen, and that's obviously not a good thing. Plants need nitrogen to grow, to make their leaves green, and so I will never incorporate compost into the soil. I just leave it on top, and all those microorganisms I was talking about, they pull that good stuff down into the soil as they can at their own rate. And that basically acts as another kind of slow release fertilizer for the plants that will be feeding them for this whole growing season. And I won't have to compost again until summer, which is pretty cool. So it's only twice a year. And basically, I'll just flatten it out a little bit, break up some of the clumps. After I've watered this, it's ready to go. But it is really important to water it because I want all of that stuff to start to blend into the soil, and also all of these microorganisms that have been living in this beautiful moist environment, it's a bit of a shock for them, so I want to be able to support them to go down and to find their new niches in their apartment buildings. So I'm just going to give this a quick water, and if you've got any questions, please feel free to shoot them through. Again, apologies for the technical difficulties. I'd probably use 2 full cans to actually water this in, but you don't need to see me water a bed. If there are any questions, Danny, I'll answer them now.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions which we'll do. Because the video has been divided into 2, because one of our other ones just died on us unexpectedly, we think it overheated, we might actually come out and do a quick film later on and post that up as a continuous film, because some people miss some stuff. So we'll get something to you all so you can watch the whole thing later. One of the questions was, where can we get some good soil from if you haven't got very good soil?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, getting it from the paths and actually taking, what natural topsoil you have, actually taking it from the paths and putting it onto your growing bed is a really, really good idea. You can buy soil from places like, landscape supply places, and they might get it supplied by Pete's and Jeffrey's, but it isn't actually soil. It's mostly composted pine bark. They might have sprinkled a bit of clay into it. If you can find stuff that does have clay in it, that's key. Otherwise, it's basically potting soil, and if you've ever had potting soil go dry, it becomes hydrophobic, water repellent, and it's not an ideal growing medium. So yeah, something with not a huge amount of sand, a little bit of clay, like 5 to 10% of clay, is really ideal. But I really encourage people to work with the soil that they've got, adding heaps of compost, respecting the structure, trying to improve the structure every year. Every soil can be improved, so don't feel like you have to buy in stuff from elsewhere. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more, which is, would it be good to grow on the east of their house? Someone wants to grow on the east.
Yeah, east is ideal spot. As I said, gets protected from the western sun, so nice and sheltered. Depending on how close to your house you're trying to grow, maybe right next to your house might not get as much sun in winter, so you might plant things that are just leafy there, that aren't trying to grow fruits and things like that. So if there's no more questions, I'm happy to answer some stuff in comments a bit after. Just want to say thanks again to our partners, Resilient South Councils and Adelaide and Mount Lofty Rangers NRM Board, and also to tell you that there's heaps more workshops coming up, and hopefully they'll be tech issue free. We're going to be out here planting next week, and then we've got lots of other fun stuff happening in the kitchen and crafty stuff as well down the line. So follow us on Facebook and on Instagram.